Welcome everyone to Natural Gas World's In a Nutshell podcast. Thierry Bros, Professor at Sciences Po Paris, and Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Research Scholar on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, join NGW once more to discuss key developments impacting the natural gas market. Welcome both. How are you doing?
Very well. Winter has started?
Absolutely, yes.
Right, yeah, winter has certainly feels like it's started. So the withdrawal season in Europe is now underway. Since we last spoke, what have you seen the market doing? And in terms of demand and supply, and what is the outlook looking forward for the winter season? Thierry, would you like to start?
Yes, good morning. So what we've seen since last time is storage filling up, and as you rightly stated, the withdrawal has started slightly earlier than last year. So we started the winter later, but with 99% storage full, which is, I would say, something we have to thank the EU Commission, because they've implemented this new regulation stating that storage operator must be 90% full. So we've achieved it. And I think that's also where we can also discuss the link between regulation and the industry. So regulation is needed to be able to provide customers, citizens with some buffer in those difficult times. So what we are going to see is the withdrawal. The question for me right now is how much withdrawal are we going to see during the winter season? The unknown is how cold is going to be winter. And for me, basically, the way I view this is if we at the end of the winter have more than 50% of our storage full, then we are okay for summer, because the summer injection will be easy. Again, we will have to be above 90% for next November. But if we are below 50%, this is going to be more difficult, because we will be at a time where there won't be so much new project coming online, and there will be more demand worldwide. So for me, the main question is how cold is going to be winter, and this, I think, we will have it to leave it to Mother Nature.
Anne-Sophie, something to add?
Yes, on to so residential demand is, of course, very important during winter. We all know about that. But what is also very interesting is the fact that industrial gas demand has not recovered at all. Looking, for example, at industrial gas demand in Germany, this year, it has been basically at about 20% below the average of 2018-2021. So this is really a very strong reduction of industrial gas demand. And this is the example of Germany, but you can see pretty much the same things in other countries, maybe at different rates. So this is a fundamental question. What has happened to industrial gas demand? Has there been some switching? Has there been some permanent destruction? I can see, looking at some annual reports, that some people are saying that their production has been replaced by imports, for example. So that is potentially a concern for the future of our industrial activity. So that's one thing. The second thing is that last year we were particularly unlucky regarding nuclear and hydro generation. And one of the reasons why we didn't manage to reduce gas demand in the power generation sector was because of these two elements. And the increases in solar and wind were not sufficient to compensate for a decline. Now we are looking at 2023, and the picture is totally different. Well, okay, nuclear is still a bit downward. We have seen some improvement in France. However, there is, of course, a decline in Germany because we shut down 3 additional nuclear power plants in April. However, the situation in hydro is much better. It's improving slightly. And well, we have seen quite a lot of rain over the past 30 days. I think in France, we have had 30 days of rain. So it's definitely improving the situation. It's probably too much rain, as you can see with the floodings in the north of France. And also, we are seeing an increase in wind generation and solar generation. But for me, the most stunning fact is the fact that power demand is decreasing quite substantially across all countries. And this is actually what is mostly driving the reduction in coal-fired generation and gas-fired generation. So, to sum up my 2 points, gas demand in the industrial sector is down and is not so much recovering a little bit in some countries because prices in Europe have come down. Gas demand in the power generation is coming down as well, but for different reasons.
What? Sorry,
If
go
I
ahead.
can add on this one, I fully agree. I mean, 2022 was industrial demand destruction. 2023 is gas for power not being there, minus 19%. And you rightly stated, and so that there was this lower power demand, which for me translates in a very simple word: recession. We've been in recession in 2022, in 2023. When I say we've, mostly Germany. And the interesting thing is, if you do not have your own energy, and if it's not affordable and secure, you will keep being in recession. And I think that's the main message for me from what Anne-Sophie stated. 2022 recession, 2023 recession. Question is, are we going in 2024, 2025, 2026 further recession, or are we going at some stage to wake up and understand that we need more energy, affordable and secure?
And affordable is very important and interesting because we have had all these debates about the price of electricity. There was an agreement in France. I mean, it was a particularly tense battle between the Prime Minister office, the Economic Minister with Mr. Le Maire, the Environment Minister with Mrs. Pannier-Runacher, and of course, EDF CEO. And finally, there had been an agreement at 70 euro per megawatt hour, but this is not making everybody happy because, of course, when you are comparing with the price of the AREN, which is a price at which a certain quantity of nuclear electricity is sold to a certain number of other players than EDF, this is much higher. So some smaller users are not very happy with that decision, but I think the government wanted to basically have a compromise between what people were asking or consumers were asking and the fact that you need also to pay for the development of the next generation of nuclear power plants whenever this is going to happen. And we are finding exactly the same discussion in Germany as well with Mr. Habeck, who is also very keen to have a relatively low price, in particular for industrial users. And we are going back to exactly that very same question, which is how do you basically support some users? But the question is which ones? And in particular, in Germany, it seems to me that the choice has been made to support the industrial users, maybe at the expense of residential consumers, which may or may not have a backlash eventually. And this is particularly interesting to see all these discussions about, electricity prices in the context of a massive push towards electrification. So we want to increase the electrification rate in transport, in industry, in residential heating. And as you have seen in Germany and in France to some extent, and I'm sure in other countries, there has been a little bit of pushback against the deployment of heat pumps because for some people, they are pretty expensive. But there is also a very important question mark about the future of hydrogen because hydrogen requires electricity. And electricity at 70 euro per megawatt hour, well, that means that hydrogen is not going to be particularly cheap. So hence the question mark. What are we doing in terms of hydrogen development, especially since there is a sell price and then there are taxes, etc., and cost of connection. So there are a lot of question marks that are being raised right now with all these discussions.
Thierry?
And I think if I may add, I mean, we've seen this in the UK with pricing the contract for difference for renewable new project being increased massively. So I think, I mean, when we are talking about affordable, I think we have two elements of this coin. One is energy prices will be higher for longer. And if I had to very sum it up very easily, I mean, we were in a 50 euro per megawatt hour electricity. Before COVID, we are now in 100 euro per megawatt hour electricity. We were in a $6 per million BTU gas. We are in a $12 per million BTU long-term prices. And you can go on all the others. So that's one part. And what Anne-Sophie mentioned is very important. You have to please your constituency. You have to be re-elected, or you have to avoid gilets jaunes, yellow vest. And when you look at it, I think there is a massive amount of subsidies that have been given. I mean, the European Commission claims that in 2022 alone, the European countries and the European Commission all together spent 390 billion euros for fuel subsidies. I mean, that's absolutely insane. 390 billion euros is just to make sure that people are not falling in fuel poverty. But at the end of the day, this is not sustainable. There will be a time where the debt will not be able to go up and up again. And I think this is also what the French economic minister stated clearly when he came out with 70 euro per megawatt hour. He stated, and I quote him, France had subsidized electricity prices by 40 billion euros, which is perhaps not exactly in line with what the EU has as a number, and this is not sustainable. So I have to have a higher electricity prices. And I think we are at this inflection point. We policy people now cannot hide themselves from stating to their constituency the green transition is going to cost a massive amount of euros. You will have to pay, by the way. And so the question is, how do we go forward from this? And we have an election in the Netherlands this week, and maybe the answer is not going to please the green agenda.
Well, and we have also the European elections next year. And honestly, this is the one which worries me quite a bit because, in certain amount of countries, we have seen the rise of populist parties. And these populist parties, usually, they do not tend to have a green agenda. They tend to be against windmills, against anything which can basically bother people. And it's true. I mean, I fully agree with you, Thierry. I mean, policymakers have now, to be honest, vis-à-vis citizens, that energy prices in general, all of them are going to be much higher. Also, because there is going to be a carbon element which has to be paid. I mean, we have not even mentioned the fact that the ETS is going to be broadened and is going to include residential and transport sectors in a couple of years from now. And this is going to have a massive effect on people's electricity and energy bills in general. So one way to help especially the poorer citizens, is to try to reduce demand, but reduce demand in the sense that it's not that you are giving up on comfort, but you are trying to be more efficient. So not trying to do what we did last year, which was really, okay, we reduce our consumption to the absolute minimum, but really teach people that energy is something which should not be taken for granted, that it has a cost, that it has a price, and that you need to use it in a better way. But you need also to help people achieve these energy efficiency gains, either with insulation or other ways. I think, there is in general a lot more energy education needed. I'm quite surprised, that at least in France, I don't think students, or at least young kids, are taught about, how much energy costs in general. I had to explain to my daughter yesterday because she's learning about mobility and soft mobility, etc., and using the bike instead of the car. And I asked her, "Do you know how much is a liter of gasoline?" And she didn't know. And I tried to explain with the example of her aunt who has to take her car to go to work and is doing about 100 kilometers per day. Thankfully, she's also able now to work from home a little bit. But that it's basically costing her aunt about 14 euros to go to work.
Wow.
And then suddenly she understood what it means. So that was an example with an oil price and a gasoline price and a car, which of course talk to people. But I think in general, kids should have an introduction to Energy 101 at a relatively young age. My daughter is 10. I think it's the right age because at that age, they start to understand cost, prices, etc.
Well, frankly, someone who doesn't drive, that cost is surprising to me as well.
100 kilometers, and she could take the train, but the train is never running, always on strike, not reliable at all. So if she wants to be on time, she doesn't have a choice.
Sure. Okay, I just move to Russia briefly. We've talked about EU proposals within the EU to ban Russian LNG before. Don't want to spend too much time on that because we've already looked at it. But these US sanctions on Arctic LNG too, I wondered if either of you had any thoughts on the impact that those measures would have for that project and Russia's LNG ambitions in general.
So what was interesting was that the sanctions were not on existing Russian LNG, but on a new LNG project. So the US is signaling to everybody who is currently importing Russian LNG and might find that, the global LNG market is tight enough. We are not touching that. However, they are touching one of the largest projects, which is expected to come online within the next year, because the first train of Arctic LNG 2 was expected to start in January 24. Now, is it going to be delayed? I don't think so, but I do not have a lot of reliable information. What I think what we need to observe is the reaction from the Japanese and from Total Energy, who have contracts. The Chinese, I think, are going to politely ignore the sanctions and take the LNG no matter what, with all due respect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've always viewed the US as a state that's very good at sanction. It's an industry sanctioning in the US, and so they are good at it, and so they know. Even if sanction at the end of the day never change any regime, we never managed to have any regime change with sanction. But they in the last 30 years understood how to put some salt when on element when it was needed. And so what they are doing here, they are putting the light on a project where, as you rightly stated, and so Total Energy or the Japanese wanted to be very quiet. And interestingly enough, if you were looking at those two companies, they were barely stating they were in those projects any longer. And so the US is putting some light here, telling them, hey guys, you're looked into. And then the question is, what are they going to do, as Anne-Sophie stated, but also what regas companies in Europe are going to do. Some may say, well, I don't want to touch an Arctic 2 LNG cargo, which will make the system more complex. So what the US is doing, I think it's an interesting example in terms of economics and geopolitics, putting the light here, saying, well, we are looking, what are you going to do? And if we are not pleased with the outcome, then we will go one step further.
Just to build upon that, I was told by some operators of regasification terminals in Europe, we definitely hope that there is not going to be a single cargo from Arctic LNG 2.
So I really think what matters here is who touches the money, because the US follows not the gas, they follow the money. And so you may have, as I have the same information as, and so, you may have regas terminals in Europe saying, well, guys, no, we don't have the security in terms of US sanctions that we can do this, so we don't want to do this. And on top of it, we are a regulated company, and so therefore the revenues we are getting from this is way too small to take this kind of risk. So I think they are making this interesting case, and they are de facto making the whole LNG industry aware of this and have to take a position. You cannot hide any longer. There is a light. The US light is there. You cannot hide. You will have to take a position, and this position will be analyzed in Washington, D.C.
And then what is going to be super interesting to see, and whether we are going to see the same situation as in the oil market, where there is Russian oil going to some countries, which then send it back to Europe. Are we going to see this Russian LNG going to China and being exported to Europe, as this is already happening? And then who is going to have to track the molecules, which of course do not have a very little flag? I mean, is it Russian LNG that you have re-exported, or is it LNG coming from another country? I mean, it's going to be a headache for some people, and I can sense that there will be some people arguing one way or another.
Absolutely, and on top of it, it will be less efficient because your cargoes will have to go to China, which is Arctic 7 cargoes, and then come back on another cargo. So you're creating tension in a system that, as Anso stated, is already tight.
Okay, well, it seems like you both had a lot to comment on that. Very interesting. Let's now turn to Asia, the market there. Key developments since we last spoke, and the outlook.
The same as before, I would say. I mean, Asian LNG demand. So in China, it's up. We just got the numbers for October. It's increasing year on year by about 30%. And it seems that we are going to have an increase of LNG imports. I mean, right now it's about between 11 and 12%. So depending on December and the actual number for November, we may beat that range, which means that we are not back to 2021 levels, but China is de facto going to be the largest LNG importer in the world. There is also increase of LNG imports in Southeast Asia, and this is somehow compensated by the fact that in Japan, because a certain number of nuclear power plants have restarted or are restarting right now, LNG demand has been done. What is also interesting is that the weather for the moment seems to be still mild in Asia, and that we are seeing some companies, in particular the Chinese, signaling their interest in re-exporting some cargoes to Europe. So the situation in Asia is okayish, but we should always be careful, because if there is a cold snap like we had 2 years ago in Northeast Asia, then the picture is going to change dramatically.
Yes, what I would say is we had a 2023 of a year of two halves. The first half, we in Europe increased our LNG intake versus 2022 because we had way less Russian pipe gas. So it makes completely sense. Since July, we are receiving more or less the same amount of Russian pipe gas than last year. So since August, September, it's around those 2 BCM per month. And so therefore we need a little bit less LNG. And so the LNG that we are receiving in Europe is a bit less, I would say, than 2022 since September, October. But as Anso stated, the risk is it could be tight somewhere, and China and Europe have winter at the same time. So the risks are on, I would say, on the LNG market. They weren't until September, because loads of LNG was available, and we were in summer, and we had a warm winter last year, which now begs the question about how cold is going to be winter.
Okay, let's move now on to policy. So the EU methane regulation, that's something to talk about, and also the outlook. What are you both expecting from COP28? It's it's not far off now.
It's not far off. I mean, I would like to expect much more on methane emissions following what has just been released in Europe last week. Also, some moves in the United States, some very small steps in China as well. And also because since this is happening in the UAE and ADNOC or ADGAS as an integrated system, they could also be in a position to make a big announcement. I know that right now they are a relatively small player in terms of LNG exports, but they want to be slightly bigger in the future with a planned project. Honestly, they are like their neighbor Qatar in an ideal position to really tackle their methane emission because they control absolutely everything. So I think, for me, the spotlight should be on them to do something, to lead by example. And we are talking about, the gold standard of OGMP 2.0. I think they should set up a platinum standard where they are doing so much better and they are putting themselves at the level of Norway, for example, which is really, really at the bottom in terms of methane intensity, at the bottom in the right sense, of course. I try to be hopeful because, methane emission has been the hot potato in the gas industry for almost a decade. We need to tackle that.
Sure.
We know the impact on climate change. We know the impact on climate. We need to do something, and we can do something. It's not like the technology is not there. And we need also to get better data, and we need to make people accept that there will be people watching over their shoulders and verifying that the data is accurate, which might be complicated in some jurisdictions.
Well, I fully agree with. And so what I would add is two things. First of all, it's a huge problem, and the industry doesn't have a very good standard in this. Let me be very clear. The first time we've heard about methane emission was in 2017, I think, an IEA report. The industry should have, from day one, solved this, whatever the cost was. It's a no-brainer, and we are nearly a decade after, and the industry is still deciding, is it what's the gold standard, the platinum standard, or whatever. And so once the industry doesn't do this, it needs regulation. And regulation needs to be tough. We go back to my storage level. It's because the industry was telling us, well, storage will be full because we believe in markets. Well, Gazprom arrived and storage weren't full in 2021. And so we had this tough regulation. So I commend the EU for having this tough regulation. It's not going to please industry, but tough luck. That's the way it works. And I agree with Anne-Sophie, this methane emission is going to be extended. And so therefore, at the end of the day, we will have the carbon and methane emission footprint of any molecules coming into Europe. That's the basis. We know how to do this. It's going to be easy to do with blockchain or whatever. And at the end of the day, everybody needs to do better, be it methane emission, be it flaring in the US, being in other places. And so the industry has waited way too long. A regulation is happening. They'll have to live with it.
And what will be particularly interesting is whether Japan follows Europe. I think we can bet on the UK being relatively aligned with this position. In any case, they are literally within the European Union system. I think Norway doesn't mind. They're already, very good. But if Japan and maybe Singapore, because, Pavilion, for example, had a contract with Qatar where they were requesting the greenhouse gas emissions, so clarity on that. If these two countries are saying, okay, we align ourselves with European Union, this is almost half of LNG imports. So that could make some things move. I would bet on these two countries first, and then maybe other countries eventually are going to align themselves with the European Union. But that would basically signal to LNG exporters, okay, guys, you have to do your homework now, and rapidly.
And unfortunately, on the other side, it will increase costs. And again, we go back to the same thing as before, but it's for climate. And it's one way consumer will have to pay a bit more for this. And again, we need to be very honest vis-a-vis consumers. It's not going to be completely for free, this thing.
Well, this is going to be interesting how this is going to be included in existing contracts. But if I can go back to what the IEA says, I mean, they say that about 40% of the current methane emission could be basically, cancelled at no cost because, you are capturing the gas and you are effectively reselling that. But you need to, of course, put those measures in place.
Yes, as long as you have the export capacity, as long as you have the pipe capacity, etc., etc. I mean, I would slightly disagree with the 40%, but it needs to be done. That's for me a no-brainer today in today's world. The second question perhaps was on COP28. Well, I'm like Sophie. I don't expect anything. Perhaps contrary to the others, I'm starting to be very pessimistic because UN is becoming irrelevant in many of its ways. I mean, UN was built to look at wars. I mean, I think in the last 12 months or 18 months or 24 months, I don't think the UN has any track record in solving any of those. And the UN on the other side is getting more and more vocal, not doing anything, but they're getting more and more vocal, so which makes it completely irrelevant. And on the COP28, I start to design what I call a dystopian scenario. I believe that if we continue to follow those silly routes of the IEA net zero scenario, or those where you constrain supply and you put more power in the hands of OPEC, because this is what the net zero scenario does in oil, you reduce the financing for gas. And at the other side of the equation, you have people that are not willing to curb demand. And I will say that my dystopian scenario starts in Germany, because what we've seen in Germany is exactly what I would call a demonstration by absurd. I mean, there is less energy available. It's more expensive. They are giving subsidies. They've decided, as Anne-Sophie stated, to close further nukes in the middle of this worst energy crisis. And now what has the economic minister of Germany stated back 2 weeks ago, and I quote him from my mind, is, "I will not phase out coal if I do not have an alternative, affordable and secure fuel." And if you're Germany and you've greenwashed the system for years and years and years, what do you think the Indians, the Bangladeshi, or the Pakistani are understanding? What they're understanding is go back to coal. And what I think is, at the end of the day, if we are ruled by somebody that is the executive director of the IEA, or perhaps I will call him Sultan Fatih, at the end of the day, we will have people moving into coal. I mean, coal production in India has increased by 10% last year and is going to increase by another 10% this year. And the coal minister of India has increased the targets of coal production in India for 2030. So at the end of the day, people will need energy and will move back to coal, which is absolutely insane for climate. So this is my dystopian scenario, but my dystopian scenario has, unfortunately, more and more probability of being the right one versus the IEA net zero scenario, which is absolutely a disaster for climate. But again, I really think we need to be completely honest. We need to make sure that it's not going to be dogmatic. It needs to be pragmatic, and pragmatism comes with small steps. Otherwise, I bet that we are going to see coal being used in Germany for longer than what the German government is telling us. And I bet we are going to see in Asia coal being used for security of supply, because they can't afford the price of gas. They don't trust us in our energy transition. And so in a failed energy transition, you go back to coal. That's, I think, is perhaps the most likely scenario to happen after COP28.
So let me build up on that. I mean, this goes in the direction of something that I have mentioned in the past, which is, we have been telling over the past 2 COPs, we need to move away from coal. First crisis in Europe happens, and what takes place in Europe is an increase in coal-fired generation for security of supply reasons. But as Thierry mentioned, what is the optic of that for people who have basically nothing? We also took away the LNG from a certain number of Southeast Asian countries. We have been telling African countries not to invest in natural gas, in particular for their own needs. But first crisis happens, and we have seen many heads of state going to a certain number of African countries, in particular Algeria, Egypt, Senegal, Angola, Congo, etc., asking, can you please develop more gas so that we can get more gas in Europe? So, we cannot say one thing and do completely the opposite. I mean, this is not consistent. And this is exactly what I think a certain number of policymakers in developing countries are not happy with when they are looking at what is happening, in particular in Europe, but also in the West in general. So there is a discrepancy between what we say and what we do. My second point is that one very important topic at COP28 is going to be climate finance. I mean, we need to make climate finance more affordable for developing countries. It's not possible that, whenever you want to finance something in Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., it costs you so much that this is basically not making any sense to invest. So this is one absolutely crucial topic. There is, there will be discussions about whether the countries, the rich countries, the Western countries are indeed going to give, the 100 billion finance which was promised in about what was it 2015, and which was has never been achieved as well. So that's another thing. What I'm concerned about is whether there is going to be a rift between the developing world and the developed world, because indeed they want to be able to consume more, whatever it is. So if we help them consuming more clean energy, that's good, but there is indeed a risk that they are going towards coal, which is in any case not the right thing to do. And let me give you an example on how dogmatic some of the institutions are. So I was at the FT conference in London at the beginning of November. There was a panel with a certain number of representatives of some European investment banks. I said, in Africa, there is about 30 BCM of gas which is flared. The CO2 is going into the atmosphere no matter what. How open would you be to finance projects to help capture that gas so that we use that gas to produce fertilizer, which therefore increases food security? And if you have a bit of spare money, maybe you can also consider investing into CCUS. But of course, you would not be able to translate that cost on the end user. The answer was that they went back to the gas-fired generation, etc., stating what their policy was telling them to do, which is, we don't really finance these kind of things, blah 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 blah. This was not my question. I was talking about food security. I was talking about fertilizer production. I was talking about basically addressing a waste of energy and a waste of CO2. And they couldn't even address that question because it's gas, because dogmatism, no gas, whatever. And this is completely stupid, with all due respect to all these institutions. And this is exactly the wrong message that we are sending to people who right now have a problem buying fertilizer because this is too expensive for them. I mean, look at the situation in many African countries because of the war in particular, because many countries were importing fertilizer or maybe other products from Russia and Ukraine, or crops. So we need to get out of that, because otherwise there will be a rift. There will be a rift between people saying, I'm sorry, but whatever, this doesn't make sense.
Yes, and and I fully agree. I mean, the rift already started, I think. I mean, the global south doesn't trust us any longer. I think that I was shocked when designing my dystopian scenario to see that not only were we preaching to South Africa to phase out coal, but if you look at who's the biggest coal producer between the EU and South Africa, you'll find out that it's the EU. Again, it seems I'm not a coal analyst, so I had to go through the data. It seems that we are lecturing dogmatic. We are providing dogmatic solutions that do not work, and then when they do not work, we have the money to be able to solve our own problem. Because, as Anne-Sophie stated, last year we've taken the LNG out of the hands of the Indian, the Bangladeshis, the Pakistani, but we've subsidized our own people. So on the other side, they had blackouts and no subsidies. So that's the way things happen. If you look at the reports on subsidies, I mean, out of the 800 billion dollars that has been subsidized last year, most of it was coming from Europe. And we are preaching to those countries, you shouldn't have fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, 124 billion euros went into fuel subsidies in Europe. I mean, it's so insane if you look at the way we've subsidized our business in our energy in Europe, is that if you look at the subsidies and you compare it per fuel, we've subsidized something like $15 per barrel of oil consumed in Europe, $15, so nearly more than the cost of production, $4 per million BTU gas, more than the cost of production, and 55 euro per megawatt hour electricity. So those are the kind of thing, and those people on the other side of the planet cannot afford not even to pay for this. And so this is why I believe my dystopian scenario is unfortunately going to start very soon. And again, if you look at the global south, remember that one of the big countries that is holding a lot of coal is Russia. Russia isn't a big exporter, but perhaps because we've sanctioned coal from Russia, perhaps Russia will also understand that they can play with the global south, providing coal, and exporting coal is not so much difficult. I mean, you need a railway. Fine. Russia knows how to build railways. So I believe we are in for a very, very tough ride going forward. And on the finance, yes, Anne-Sophie, but do we have the money left? That's also the question. I mean, when you're going to say you need to pay $100 billion dollars or euros for this, I'm not so sure it's going to go on very well in terms of election and re-election. So I think the question is, maybe we'll end up with a nice wording about finance. But again, remember, we've ended with a nice wording on Article 6. I think it was in Paris, and since then we haven't solved it. So what I look is the outcome, and the outcome are, I think, not very positive going forward.
I think, I mean, to be a little bit more optimistic, maybe there might be ways to make finance more affordable to developing countries, rather than paying 8%, whatever, that they pay, whatever Western countries are paying. But for that, you need a little bit more mobilization. What I'm concerned is that if your dystopian scenario actually moves forward, we are going to see more and more climate change impact that we are already seeing. I mean, the fires that we have experienced over the summer, the completely crazy temperatures that we are seeing right now in Brazil, and on top of that, with the fires, some of them in the rainforest, the droughts that we are seeing in the same countries. I mean, this is particularly worrying. So we may actually not reach totally your dystopian scenario because it will take time to invest into all this coal. However, we might actually move into a disorderly transition more rapidly than we think, especially if the impact on climate happens much faster than we anticipated. And let's not forget that in all the scenarios, there is something which is called hydrogeneration in particular, which everybody takes for granted. But as we have seen in the past, it should not be taken for granted.
It's called a dystopian scenario, so I'm not wishing for this one.
We're going to depress everybody who is listening ahead of COP.
I guess my closing comments on COP28 is on coal. Would you expect to see any sort of fresh commitments similar to the phasing down pledge that you saw in Glasgow, which was not overly ambitious, but even in its modest aims, efforts haven't really lived up to expectations because of the energy crisis, because of the resurgence of coal in a lot of places. Would you expect to see something like that? And I was also in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan last month, and at this oil and gas conference, there was a surprisingly big focus on methane emissions. And as you know, Turkmenistan has had quite a lot of scrutiny in the media over the past couple of years about this. Would you expect to see any sort of commitment coming from Turkmenistan there at COP or before COP, given that it would seem like in terms of how COP, how you gauge the success of COP, it would seem like at least a PR boon if you had some commitment from Turkmenistan on methane emissions.
On coal, ask
Yeah.
China, first of all. I mean, if any country, China is half of the coal market. So, whatever happens in China is going to dwarf anything else which is happening in the rest of the world. Let me also note that when I am looking at the plans for most Southeast Asian countries, when they are looking at, what is going to feed their future power generation, usually there is coal in the picture, on top of renewable gas, etc. But there is usually coal, sometimes with CCUS, but usually there is coal. So that's one thing. On Turkmenistan, okay, given that they are not exporting to Europe, what would be the incentive for them to reduce their methane emissions, and who is going to pay? Or are they just looking at Europe saying, we could eventually export to you if you want, and we could replace some Russian gas whenever. I mean, I would not build a pipeline from Turkmenistan to Europe, because by the time it's built, etc., maybe our demand would be really down, but whatever. But who is going to pay for that? I mean, last I checked, the price of gas in Turkmenistan is it still zero? Or I am pretty sure it's negligible. I mean, is China interested in seeing Turkmenistan emitting less methane? They are the largest buyer of Turkmen gas. I am not sure. They have not even signed the global methane pledge.
Well, that could be something that they might commit to, potentially.
You are really hopeful.
I'm not hopeful.
It's not COP.
I'm just
it's
raising
Christmas.
the question. Thierry, any thoughts?
On coal, on top of ask China, I will say, look at what India is doing. I mean, in India, they have a coal minister that increased the target of producing coal by 60% between now and 2030, and this was last week, ahead of COP, basically. And so I really think the global South doesn't care any longer. So yes, you may have ministers flying in, flying out of COP28. There might be some kind of wording, but again, I mean, remember what we've done in Paris. We knew we were not going to achieve the 2. So the wording in Paris changed from 2 to 1.5 to 2. I mean, degree C. I mean, we knew we weren't going, but we made it, and Paris was viewed as a great achievement. So at the end of the day, you can greenwash this thing in a way it's palatable to the press. But the question is, for me, is really how much CO2 are we going to reduce? And so far we haven't. We are years in, years out increasing the CO2 emission. So I mean, so far COPs have failed. And this one for me will be just the 28th failure of this. On the methane in countries that do not sell gas to Europe, I would agree with Anso. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for them to go through this. Why should they invest in those? I mean, price for their citizen is zero. I'm not so sure those countries are also really the first one in line when you're thinking about climate change. I mean, it's more, as Anso mentioned, Brazil, the island, and all those areas. So for them, really, it's not top of their priority list. The top of their priority list is to be able to perhaps produce more gas and to sell it to China. If they didn't have enough gas, then maybe they would go for this methane pledge. But as long as they are sitting on one of the biggest gas fields in the world, just drill, baby drill, and that solves the problem, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, thank you both for giving me your insights. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Natural Gas Worlds in a Nutshell podcast. See you next time.